Good evening and welcome to On the Record. I'm WRAL Capitol Bureau Chief Laura Leslie. Well, it's that time of year at the legislature. The state budget is in the negotiation stage. We've already seen what the House and Senate want, and they're pretty far apart on a number of things. One of the biggest sticking points is likely to be tax cuts. House and Senate leaders have already agreed to cut the personal income tax rate by 0.25% next year, from 4.25% this year to 3.99%. But the Senate wants to go a lot deeper with another 0.5% cut in 2027. They say it would put more money back into people's pockets. But the nonpartisan economists who work for state lawmakers say it'll result in a budget shortfall. For the average taxpayer making $50,000 a year, the Senate plan would mean an extra $186 a year. That's about $15.50 a month. To a dad like Carrie Thomas, every dollar helps. What could you do with $186 a year?
Probably groceries or something like that, but no money is free money.
It would not be free money. The cut would mean the state would give up about $2 billion a year, or just over 5% of its budget. The budget experts who work for state lawmakers say that would leave the state with a budget shortfall. Unlike the federal government, North Carolina cannot have a deficit, so there would likely need to be some cuts to government services like schools and roads. Thomas doesn't like the sound of that.
I know that there's a lot of trouble with the Department of Education right now, and I've got 2 little ones, so I'm team education.
Republican Senate leader Phil Berger doesn't believe the economic forecast. He thinks the state will grow faster than economists say, and any money the state doesn't need should go back to taxpayers. But Democratic Senator Natalie Murdoch says the state does need that money.
That's $2 billion we could use to preserve Medicaid expansion, to provide more relief out west, to support education.
There's also the threat of cuts to federal funding as President Trump looks for ways to pay for federal tax cuts. Environmental engineer Matthew Upperly works with a lot of people in government. He says $186 a year would be nice, but
I'd prefer to keep the services intact. If there's going to be more uncertain funding coming from the federal government for certain services, I think I personally would prefer to keep sort of the state budget more stable.
Well, that's the thinking among state House leaders as well. They're proposing to put any future tax cuts on hold for right now. Joining us to talk about this tonight are Representative Tim Longus, a House Republican from northwestern Wake County, and State Republican Party spokesman Matt Mercer. Thank you for being here, gentlemen. Matt, does the party really have a position on tax cuts in general? I mean, is more always better? Are we getting to the point where we could be looking at the Kansas experiment, the infamous situation with Governor Brownback back in 2012 when they went a little too far?
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. I would say the great thing is that I think Republicans have decisively won the argument that we need to continue cutting taxes, and that's for the House and Senate leadership. They'll work out the differences on that. But I would just say that North Carolinians have shown time and again by returning strong majorities to Raleigh for Republicans that we need to continue to cut taxes, but also monitor where our spending is. In the package before, you see they're talking about revenue and spending potential shortfalls. I think time and again they've been pretty wrong because they're really not taking that growth into account, where our state has consistently brought in more money than they've projected. And it's because of the Laffer curve and cutting taxes. So we're fully on board with the tax cuts, and we'll let them sort out kind of where that ends.
Tim, Laffer curve, what are your thoughts about that?
So I think we've seen, the Republicans have been in control of the state for, well over a decade now. And we've seen the results of that. We've seen vacancies in state government. We've seen a lot ongoing struggles with the Department of Motor Vehicles. We've seen struggles to recruit and retain teachers in the classroom. And what we're seeing now is that Republican leadership is divided. The Senate is both chambers, the House and the Senate, both controlled by Republicans, chose to lock in future tax cuts, even though our state is a growing state and we need more revenue to keep up with that growth. And what the nonpartisan fiscal staff at the legislature have shown is that by the end of this decade, in 27-28, we'll be facing a $2 billion budget deficit in North Carolina, and by 28-29, a $3.3 billion budget deficit if those tax cuts stay as they're going to happen. So our concern as Democrats is that we need to be responsible with our state's fiscal health, and we need to make sure that we're paying for the services that our people need to survive and thrive.
Sure. I mean, they agreed on these triggers, as they call them, these revenue levels several years ago, right? At least I think 2023, perhaps. And they now say that they weren't factoring in the amount of inflation that we've seen in 2023, 2024, and the amount of growth of the state. They say that the triggers did not adequately account for how much more it was going to cost to simply run state government. Is it possible that it's time for those triggers to be adjusted?
I don't think so, but I'll go back to one point that Representative Longus made, in that state vacancies and problems with motor vehicles. Those are administration problems, all created by Democrats. What we have are, when you have money problems versus management problems, it's more on the management side with how Democrats have been running these agencies. I think the trigger policy was overall effective because it gives companies that ability to plan. These people could see that we hit those triggers. We hit that because our state is going to continue to grow. We're going to be the 7th largest state by the end of the decade. So really factoring that into account, I think, is more of a problem on management versus legislators wanting taxpayers and families to have more money in their pockets.
Well, but I mean, the state workers need money in their pockets too, though, right? And I mean, isn't that kind of the reason that we've heard that a lot of these vacancies exist?
That's absolutely right. And, just on the triggers, when you're going off a cliff in a train, you want to stop the train to keep it from going off the cliff. What the Republicans have done is set our state on a course to go off a fiscal cliff by the end of this decade. One conductor, the Senate, is saying, let's go even faster. Let's accelerate these tax cuts. The other conductor, the House Republican leadership, are saying, wait a minute, we see this cliff coming. Let's raise these triggers and at least slow the cuts that we're going to be experiencing at that time. I think the House proposal, Democrats would certainly have done a different proposal that more fully invested in our state workforce and all that. But at least on taxes, the House proposal at least acknowledges the fiscal reality that we face.
Sure. And I was going to say, I mean, the governor, of course, proposed neither a tax cut this year nor tax cuts in the future. He said he wanted to just freeze the tax cuts altogether and just stay at the level that we're at. But Democrats, a lot of Democrats in the House voted for the House Republican budget. I mean, what do you make of that?
I think that it's a sign that, one, Democrats are willing to work across the aisle to get stuff done, and two, where the Republicans in the House are is more aligned with where the state needs to be than where the Senate proposed package was. Again, Governor Stein proposed a proposal that kept tax rates where they were. That's not a tax hike. That's just keeping taxes at the level they are, and it also ensures that out-of-state shareholders of corporations also pay their fair share in taxes, which neither proposal adequately addresses. But I think that we're just ensuring that that our state stays on a positive fiscal path, and that's why Democrats supported the package.
Right, absolutely. I'm going to come back to this question after the break because, Matt, I know you've got something to say about that. We're going to go to a break right now. When we come back, we will talk some more with Tim Longest and Matt Mercer, and we'll talk a little bit about the state's clean energy economy and why uncertainty in Washington could put the brakes on a booming business. Stay with us. Welcome back to On the Record. We're here with Representative Tim Longest, Democrat from Wake County, and NCGOP spokesman Matt Mercer. Thanks for being here. Matt, we wanted to go back to something we talked about before the break, which was, Representative Longest, you said, well, it's not a tax hike if you don't come through with tax cuts that you promised. I have a feeling you feel differently about that.
Yeah, it goes back to the certainty that we had talked about before, but I'll also say that we're now over 12 years into tax reform implemented by Republicans, and the things that you see the editorial boards and everyone else warning about hasn't happened. The track record shows that when you're cutting taxes and people keep more of their own money, you're building an economy, you're bringing businesses in, you're able to do all of those things because people trust and like the environment they're in. That's why you see every state around us has done their own tax reform too to catch up to North Carolina, and that's why we can't let off the gas with tax cuts.
I will say, I should mention that this week we got the revised budget numbers out, the availability numbers for this budget year and going forward. And those numbers have been revised down, which is not, for years and years and years, you're right, they were always conservative and they would always revise up. The April surprise would always be a good one. This one was not so great, and it's going to be a little tighter than they thought. So it'll be interesting to see whether that has some bearing on what they decide to do with those tax cuts. All right, well, Governor Stein this week called on Congress to protect clean energy tax credits. He said they're key to the state's continued economic growth. Speaking of, President Donald Trump has called for an end to those credits, saying they're a waste of taxpayer dollars. Some congressional Republicans are proposing to repeal them. Well, Stein says North Carolina is one of the top states in the nation for clean energy tech, but that could change.
repealing these credits would cost the state tens of thousands of jobs by 2030 and billions of dollars in investment that is ready to be made.
Stein said repealing the credits could also endanger investments that are already underway. He said businesses made decisions that were based on those tax credits, and they need to be able to get the terms that they agreed to. North Carolina currently ranked in the top 5 in the country for installed solar capacity. So, Matt, public funding for clean energy has been a sore spot with some Republicans for some time now. And obviously, President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act from 2022 sort of put that on steroids. Why do you think, why are Republicans now talking about repealing those credits instead of letting this continue, since it is booming?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things going on here. So you have an acknowledgement that we, in fact, do have a $36 trillion debt that is not going away federally anytime soon. But I took a look at some numbers before coming in today. 41% of North Carolina's energy comes from natural gas production. 33% comes from nuclear. So we're talking about, at the most, 15% of our state's energy coming in. I think more focus needs to be on how do we reduce those input costs for businesses and reduce energy costs for consumers. And I think that's by continuing to expand what are our largest 2 sectors here, talking about pipelines and talking about nuclear energy versus these sort of solar energy panels, which we know are coming from China and likely will be subject to some tariffs in the very near future. So I just think it's something that we need to talk about. Our energy policy is improving what we already have, and something that helps improve costs for consumers. And the clean energy sector just hasn't proven they can do that without the federal government's help yet.
Representative Longest.
Well, I completely disagree with that. North Carolina is one of the leading states in the country in renewable energy, including solar energy. We've produced 17,000 new jobs since the Inflation Reduction Act went into effect. These jobs, these investments, the $20 billion that's come from these tax credits and investments from the federal level disproportionately go to benefit rural communities in North Carolina. And those are the folks that you're talking about hurting by taking those jobs away, by repealing these tax credits, because it introduces more uncertainty into the environment for these folks who made their investments in North Carolina based on those policies.
Right. And for one thing, solar, obviously, the sunshine is free, right? You're saying it wouldn't be as cheap if it weren't for the government price supports and subsidies?
It's really not, especially when you look at the cost of implementing those panels, because the sun's also not always shining either. That's kind of a simple explanation, but there's a lot of input cost that goes into the installation of that and building that infrastructure. It's simply not done without the federal government's help. And I think there's an acknowledgement from Washington, and certainly the Senate will play a role in adjusting some of those credits. They're all not ending tomorrow. Some of them weren't ending until 2027, 2029. So I think there's still a great deal to be worked out. Mm-hmm. But generally, North Carolina's energy is not coming from that source. It's not going to all of a sudden have the lights turn out in North Carolina if we're adjusting some of these tax credits.
But some of the biggest investments that we've gotten in North Carolina in clean tech, at least, have not been in solar. They've been in EV and batteries, right? And that's the answer to your cloudy day, according to Governor Stein yesterday when he was speaking at a energy forum. Representative Longest, these batteries, this EV technology, we've been growing sort of a baby battery belt, I guess is what they've been calling it, mm-hmm. With these makers here in North Carolina. What would it mean, do you think, in these communities for some of these big factories to just simply not materialize? I'm thinking, for example, VinFast in Chatham County.
I think that this would be tremendously detrimental to rural North Carolina. These are jobs that have been promised, that they're counting on, and they've been made based on investments and tax credits coming from our federal government. So the responsible decision, I think, is to continue those tax credits, understanding that that's what attracted business here in the first place. North Carolina and the United States have an opportunity to be and remain a global leader in the clean energy marketplace. By stepping away from these tax cuts and these investments that we're really powered by the Inflation Reduction Act, the current administration is putting that reputation in jeopardy.
Yeah, if these credits do end up getting cut and North Carolina does end up losing some jobs and some investments, is the Republican Party ready to own that as the president's position?
Yeah, I would say, speaking first of all to VinFast, I think their problems have predated whether there's going to be a tax credit there or not for EVs. But really what Republicans are concerned about is giving consumers choice, repealing things like EV mandates, certainly the California standard where you're going to sell 100% electric cars by 2035. That is completely unrealistic. Running farm equipment off of batteries is unrealistic. But giving consumers that choice is so much better than mandating these things. And that's where Republicans are coming in and saying, no, you can compete in the market if it's that great. And some people think it still is. It may still be happening. So why are we subsidizing it when we can also do things to help more customers by reducing those costs?
Representative Longus, I'll give you a quick last word, 30 seconds or so.
Sure. I think that, this marketplace has been good for consumers. It does expand choices for the types of renewable energy a user can obtain. You don't just have to go to the utility companies to get it now. And it's important that we continue to invest in that choice to make sure not only that our future is brighter, but that we have jobs here in North Carolina.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Matt Mercer, NCGP spokesman, Representative Tim Longus, Democrat from Wake County. We really appreciate your being here and joining this conversation for us. When we come back, we'll be talking to WRAL state government reporter Will Doran and WRAL's climate change reporter Liz McLaughlin about some of these exact same topics. So come back to us. And we're back on the record tonight. Joining me in the studio, WRAL state government reporter Will Doran and WRAL climate change reporter Liz McLaughlin. Liz, you track a lot of the clean energy stuff and the climate change stuff for us here at the station, and you've been kind of all over the state looking at some of these issues. What are you hearing out there as you're talking to people and people are watching what's happening in D.C.?
Well, I guess generally, we just look at after the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, this clean energy boom that happened in North Carolina. And a lot of companies that came here, tell me that was part of the decision-making process. Chempower, for instance, Finnish company, EV chargers, world headquarters in Durham. They said state and federal incentives brought them here. So now we're seeing it's a little bit of a question mark as to what kind of the fallout will be with the policy shift. But there's definitely a little bit of nervousness. And we just saw some numbers nationally. E2 just came out that $14 billion nationally in investment has been lost in that clean energy section, 10,000 jobs.
And that's just since the beginning of the year.
Exactly. And just $4.5 billion in April, for example. So those are big numbers. Now, we haven't seen any big announcements in North Carolina yet, but I think we could see some hesitancy from investors, right? I mean, we're seeing this wind whiplash, for instance, in the wind sector with Empire Wind off the coast of New York. There was a stop work order and a pause. It cost millions, $500 million a week, for this pause. So something like that is going to be a factor when an investor is looking, hey, should I invest in those projects off the North Carolina coast? Those might be 10 years down the road, but you might be hesitant if every administration, there's going to be a big policy change that might impact you economically.
It certainly does make it difficult to decide what the best long-term investment is going to be, doesn't it? Absolutely. Okay, so let me just ask this. I mean, in terms of wind power, how much is North Carolina getting right now? We don't have that much really built yet, right?
Yeah, it's all a really long timeline just because of the permitting process. So there's 3 different properties off the North Carolina coast, or areas, wind areas, because it's, on the water. But I just actually talked to Kathleen Collins of the, basically to get an update, and it's just a lot of question marks. I mean, even with Dominion, that's just north of us off the coast of Virginia, there's turbines up, but they're still a few years out. So it's still a big question mark as far as wind for North Carolina. No, we're definitely well suited to have a lot of wind power, but a lot of the policy that pushed emission cuts, that pushed carbon cutting in the energy sector is really what pushed, progress in that wind sector to begin with.
Right, and a lot of those policies are changing. Will, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the state budget. Of course, we talked a lot about the state tax cuts earlier in the program, and that's obviously going to be one sticking point. But there are many sticking points, right? We have a brand new speaker. How is that working out this year?
Yeah, Dustin Hall has taken over as speaker for Tim Moore, who's now in Congress, and obviously he's going up against, in these budget negotiations, Senate Leader Phil Berger, who has been in charge of the Senate the entire time since Republicans have taken over. So, I mean, he is really an established force of North Carolina politics. Hall is young, he's mid-30s, my age, and, now stepping into this leadership role. And that's a big, dynamic to take on in these budget negotiations. And we've seen some sharp elbows getting thrown already. I mean, these budget negotiations are never overly friendly.
No.
People might just imagine, oh, well, it's all Republicans, in charge of the legislature. That does not mean that they agree on things. And, we always see, people's bills getting taken hostage. Even if a lot of people might agree that, hey, that's good policy, we should pass it, it might get, stopped from going forward over, completely unrelated negotiations in the budget. So it's going to be a tall task for Dustin Hall to get everything that the House wants. And I don't think either chamber is going to get everything that they want. But
there's an old saying that the opposition is the other party, but the enemy is the other chamber. So, and that is really kind of how they come down, especially, we saw big differences in the budget this year. I mean, I can't think of a year in which we've seen larger differences from the House and Senate coming out. I mean, everything from really big pay raises for teachers in the House budget to very small ones in the Senate. What are some of the things you think we're going to be probably sitting here talking about in August and September?
Well, I think it was absolutely right to talk about tax cuts, and because the two chambers are so massively apart on that. We're talking, over $1 billion worth of tax cuts on the Senate side and just a small fraction of that on the House side. But it's not just the tax cuts. There's also, like you said, the raises. The Senate wants to do fairly small raises for most state employees, around 1.25%, although people like state troopers, prison workers would get substantially larger, 8-9% raises. The House wants to do about double the baseline raises, 2.5% for your typical state worker. But they also have this plan to essentially cut a lot of vacant jobs in these agencies as well and use the money that had been sort of set aside for those jobs that haven't been filled to boost people's wages on top of that. So the exact raise you get would probably depend on the size of your department. If you're a big department or one with lots of high-paying jobs that are getting slashed, then you could see yourself getting a bigger raise from this. You could, but a lot of those agencies are already using that money in different ways. They're using it to sort of shore up other operations, things that have been cut. I'm thinking DEQ, for example, has had tremendous cuts over the past decade. So they're using that money. And so what happens when that money suddenly gets repurposed for something else and they have to go find that money somewhere else in the budget and it just doesn't exist? Yeah, well, and they are looking at places to find money. I took some notes because the numbers are just so all over the place, but there's a big plan to build a new children's hospital in the state. We don't have a dedicated children's hospital, and this is a multi-billion-dollar plan to build one somewhere here in the Triangle. And the state has already put about $320 million into it. The House wants to take $100 million of that funding away, so basically cut its funding by a third. The Senate wants to add an extra $500 million to that. So, here's just one instance of, one chamber is looking at this project to take money, whereas the other chamber sees it as a big priority that we need to be adding to. There's also things like Helene recovery aid. The Senate wants to put about $700 million more into Helene recovery. We've already done about $1.5 billion, and the House wants to do only about $450 million. So everyone agrees that we need more for Helene, but they're off again by hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, that is all the time that we have for tonight. But thank you so much, WRAL State Government reporter Will Doran, WRAL's climate change reporter Liz McLaughlin. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining us here at home. If you have something to say about tonight's discussion, email us your comments, questions, or criticisms on the record at WRAL.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.